How do you become the guy that's going to try over and over and over again and prepare? And there is this this idea that the more you prepare, you visualize things enough, and then you visualize them when they don't go the right way either. And so then when you're in that moment where things haven't gone as planned, you can make faster decisions because you've thought about it already. You've had the multiple iterations, whether you're sitting in a chair visualizing like you're in the cockpit, whether you're out on, the basketball court shooting hoops, or you're in a boardroom practicing for a critical negotiation or meeting. The more you think through it and practice it, your mind is that much better prepared in that moment.
Thank you so much for tuning into Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. I'm your host, as always, Christian D. Evans, coming in at you. Now, most of us, we want to go out there and build incredible businesses and all that stuff and just be incredible leaders and CEOs and founders. However, though, the question is when crap hits the fan, which we know it will, when all of a sudden there's not enough money in the bank, when all of a sudden that big client is evaporating, when all of a sudden something happens, a recession or something you can't control like COVID, all of a sudden happens, what do you do under that situation? That's the reason why I wanted to have this next guest on. Now, she has been and served in the Air Force for 24 years as a fighter pilot and senior military leader. She is a keynote speaker, best-selling author, which we're going to be diving into her book, Flying in the Face of Fear. She's also tells her story about a life-changing combat experiences while weaving in ideas and lessons about leadership, teamwork, perseverance, and decision-making in stressful environments. While weaving, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my next guest, Colonel Kim Casey Campbell. How are you doing today, Casey?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, I'm so excited about diving into this because, again, like I mentioned, you have an immense amount of experience in these situations. And specifically, I know you were a fighter pilot for many missions. I could have just gone on, just amazing, as well as 1,800 hours under your belt as a A-10 Warthog. Though, let me ask you this, Casey. When you were in those situations, how did you anticipate? Because in those situations, things move. The mission just doesn't go as planned. And so I'd love to get your response. What kind of person did you have to become to anticipate change, which is a consistent in missions?
Yeah, I will tell you that on every single mission I've ever flown, so I've had more than 100 missions in combat and a couple thousand hours in the airplane. And there was not a single mission ever that ever went exactly as planned, right? Everything adjusts and change, and sometimes they're surprises, sometimes they're good, and sometimes they're bad. And so I have had to learn to adapt and overcome and be flexible throughout my years of flying. And I spent 24 years in the Air Force, not just flying airplanes, but also leading large teams. And so these concepts that I learned over Iraq and Afghanistan, I could use them when I was leading large teams as well, because I think no matter what you do in leadership, no matter how well prepared you feel, something's going to happen that is going to catch you off guard. And it's change, it's things that you couldn't even anticipate. For me, my career started right after 9/11, and I don't think any of us could anticipate what happened on 9/11 and how it would impact and change our lives. And I think right now we're seeing something similar with COVID, of it being such a significant impact to us, and we really couldn't fathom how it would impact all of us. So for me, I think the key thing for all of these things, whether it's change or facing the unknown, it's being prepared, it's practicing, so putting in the work, and then planning for contingencies, because nothing will ever go as exactly as planned.
And what I love about the military, specifically, definitely when you're in the sky and you're flying with these other individuals, is you have to have this chemistry. It's just like a teamwork. It's like an NFL. It's these, you just have to have this unknown chemistry, and you really can't even describe it, but you just have to. But in order to do that, there are certain things that have to fall in place to have that chemistry. And so I would love to ask, because that's true teamwork at the highest level, where you can anticipate, hey, I can trust on XYZ person because, hey, I can do this and I can come in at a different fly angle. So I'm curious, Kim, what do you think needs to happen to build that this unorthodox chemistry that we don't see a lot of teams achieve?
Yeah, I think part of it is we build a culture in our flying squadrons, and we call it a wingman culture, but it's this idea that everyone is dependent on each other for the success of the mission. And we create trust because we have to. And we build an environment where we know we have to rely on each other. We understand the roles that we each individually play and how that fits into the bigger picture. And so we very clearly understand our roles and the role we play and how critical it is to the mission. But this doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen immediately. And, you get new people coming in and out of a squadron. And so there's the way that we go about this is that we work together. It goes back to, what I was talking about just in terms of preparation. I mean, before every mission, there's so much preparation that goes in terms of working together and going through and briefing all of the things that we're going to do. And then we take the time, we will practice. We actually do something we call chair flying, where we'll essentially visualize a mission before it ever occurs. We can talk through it, walk through it, talk about the details, and talk about all those key components and understand which role each person is going to play. And then as part of that, we plan for contingencies, right? We talk about those worst case scenarios. What if this gets happen? What if you get hit by an enemy missile? What are all those those worst case scenarios? We talk about them. We have our plan to deal with it. We understand how we each are going to rely on each other in those really difficult moments. And then we go out and execute. And by doing that preparation in advance, one, it creates just an understanding among all the team members, but it also creates kind of this buy-in where everybody understands what they need to do, the role they play when the shit hits the fan, as you said. I mean, it's just, you understand how your specific job is critical to the entire mission.
And correct me if I'm wrong, in these situations, everybody wants to be team lead, but not everybody can, right? And not everybody at the same time as well. And so there's certain things, like you said, correct me if I'm wrong, you have to put your ego aside, right? And say, hey, this is for the bigger vision. What other things as a character person, because I love what you're saying, you have to be very clear on your role. Your position is, hey, you know what? You're doing X, Y, Z, but you're not going to go maybe do this, which is maybe what you want to do, but you have to put that ego aside. What other things do you think the kind of character you need or the characteristics that you need to be able to say, okay, hey, I visualize in the bigger vision, the mission, and that's really what it comes down to. And it's not about my ego. It's not about my ribbon, my rack, whatever it is.
Yeah. It's this idea that it's not about me, it's about the team, right? It's our larger purpose. And for me, and I think for other A-10 pilots, our purpose, our primary mission, our passion was all about supporting troops on the ground. And so everything we did was directed at that. And one of the things that I learned early in my flying career was this idea that as pilots, we had to be humble, approachable, and credible. So there's the humble piece, right? Setting the ego aside, which I think most people would think fighter pilots and they think egos, they think, that humility is probably not one of those things that comes to mind, but humility is so important. And it's so important as a fighter pilot, but it's important in leadership as well. And then this idea of being approachable, like, is your team actually going to come talk to you if they don't understand? If they don't understand the mission and what they're supposed to do in the role they play, are you approachable? Are you approachable in a way that, people will come find you when things aren't going wrong, so they can share those little problems before they become big problems. And then credibility is key. And I think that's something individually that we all have to work on, is our own credibility. But then we have a responsibility as leaders to ensure that our team is credible, right? We have a responsibility to lift others on our team to make sure that they are credible as well. So kind of talking about the fighter pilot piece here, I learned it in flying training, but I've used it as I'd carried over into my role as a leader of teams as well.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm kind of diving into this is because a lot of our audience, they're like, okay, I'm establishing a team. But one of the things, I was just got off a business conference, and it's like, you want to get a team that's not, oh, I have to do this, but I want to, right? It's a total different paradigm shift. And in order to do that, there has to be buy-in, like kind of what you were talking about a little bit. And so, but there's also has to be that congruency of that chemistry that it's like, I can't even explain it. It's like, hey, I'm looking this way and I can throw the ball in a basketball game and I know that player is going to be there because we've done that play 1,000 times. And so you were talking about, obviously, being approachable, the kind of, like you said, the roles and specific roles. Also, let me ask you, how can you develop those environments to anticipate that on a consistent basis, where it's like, okay, hey, maybe you're out there doing training and you've done that same play or done that same flight pattern 1,000 times, where, hey, I know that I can trust this person. There's that trust that's established. And it's like, hey, when we're in that situation, boom, I know that when we're in the game, right, if you will, quote unquote,
Yeah.
when we're in war, that this is happening and we know that this is consistent.
I think a lot of it is, it's this whole idea, like you actually have to prepare for adversity before it happens. So, you don't want to build trust in the moment of like COVID kicks off and you're like, well, shit, now I got to build this culture of trust on my team. Like it all goes back to, starting before. And so in the flying world for us, it is all about you build that trust, you create those relationships. A lot of that is through training and relying on each other and seeing how you go through hard things together in training so that when it comes time to do it for real for us in combat, we're ready. We trust each other. You talk about like having this common purpose and I very much believe in you have to be able to share the why. This all goes back to Simon Sinek and starting with why and having that common purpose and belief to unite everybody together. And I think that's a key part of it. But for us, we had a common purpose. We had a common belief. We built that in training, multiple iterations of training, being vulnerable in front of each other, because we make mistakes, we fail in the process, and then we come out of that on the other side better. But you've got to create that culture, that environment of trust and connection and vulnerability before the hard times happen. You have to prepare for that adversity in advance. And so we did that all along, all through our training. Sometimes it had to happen quick because things happened when you weren't expecting them. But if you have the time, you want to prepare for that. You want to take the time to really build that environment of trust, connection, and vulnerability. The other thing I think about, you talked about, how do you have that belief and those ideas and that drive to work together as a team? I think for us, and I've used this term fighter pilot mindset. It's this mindset that we have as a team, as fighter pilots, to always try to get better, because we want to be the best at what we do. And so we're always striving to improve. You do that by failing. You do that by making mistakes. You do that by debriefing those things, because failure and mistakes is okay as long as you learn from it and do it differently the next time. And so we've created this environment where we trust each other. We're willing to go try hard things, try new things, be a little bit innovative. And sometimes that means we fail. Sometimes that means we make mistakes along the way. But instead of this culture of like punishment and, making fun of people for things, we're just like, okay, got it. That didn't work. Let's figure it out the next time. Now, granted, we still poke a little fun at each other because that's kind of part of our culture as well. But it's all in good nature because we have a great environment to work in.
So, and I love this. I appreciate you diving into this. So it is a preparation. In order to prepare, you have to have that vulnerability, authenticity, connection. And like you were saying, the way to do that is by going out there, taking action and anticipating contingency, anticipating obviously certain things that go wrong, kind of terrible in that mission place. My question then is, if that's true, when that is, which is what you just said, then how can you create that environment during the preparation time to grow that? Because one of the things I learned is like one person does a 3-point shot and says, oh, I made it in. And then they go focus on training something else. But the really expert guy goes, hey, you know what? I get that third 3-point shot in. Wonderful. I'm going to keep practicing that 1,000 times till when all of a sudden I'm under pressure, it becomes so natural. I don't even think about it. It's so subconscious. Yeah. And I think that's like a whole nother level. And that's what you guys do in the fighter pilot world. You guys practice and train and train and practice and train over and over and over. And maybe the same thing. So I'd love to understand a little bit, when you're doing that, what does that look like just in the environment to facilitate that vulnerability, that authenticity, that connection on a consistent basis?
Yeah, so I'll answer this two ways. Once I'll answer it kind of as the individual fighter pilot, like how we strive to be the best and how, we continuously work to improve. And part of that goes back to this idea of chair flying, but it's this there is a pressure to perform, right? There's a pressure to be the best at what you do. And you talked about this, how do you become the guy that's going to try over and over and over again and prepare? And there is this, this idea that the more you prepare, you visualize things enough, and then you visualize them when they don't go the right way either. And so then when you're in that moment where things haven't gone as planned, you can make faster decisions because you've thought about it already. You've had the multiple iterations, whether you're sitting in a chair visualizing like you're in the cockpit, whether you're out on, the basketball court shooting hoops, or you're in a boardroom practicing for a critical negotiation or meeting. The more you think through it and practice it, your mind is that much better prepared in that moment under stress when things have gone terribly wrong, that you've thought through this before, you've seen it in your mind before. And so you can make that faster decision. Are you going to still feel maybe a little stress and fear? Yes, but you are much better prepared to react. Now, this kind of the second part of this is like, how do you create that environment of connection and authenticity and vulnerability? And I think, honestly, it starts with the leader. It starts with the leader of the team, and a leader has to be willing to give trust before they are going to receive it. And they just have to kind of go all in. And I think part of that is just taking the time to create connections on a team. I think even in a fighter squadron, like 100%, I knew that our squadron commander, like he had our backs. Like we were going to work hard. If we made mistakes, we might hear about it. We're gonna talk about it, but he's going to have our back no matter what. And that went a long way. Just he cared about us as individuals, from a personal standpoint, but also the professional standpoint, caring about us to make sure that we also performed. And so I think a leader has that critical role to show some of that vulnerability first, to be authentic with a team, to create those connections. That sets the example, that creates that environment. If a leader can stand up and say, guys, I screwed this up, I should have done it this way. Here's what I did wrong. Here's what I want you guys to take away from it. Then right there, you've set an example of like, people are now more willing to do that themselves. So I think it starts with the leader. Absolutely.
I love that. I love that. Just so incredible. And so this loops me right into kind of when you're in that situation, and like you mentioned, almost all your missions, they did not go as planned. And so what's interesting is you were telling me, obviously vulnerability, authenticity, connection that helps facilitate where when you're in that situation, then you're not thinking about it like, oh, what should we do? Oh my gosh, and experiencing emotion, experiencing fear, because none of that is, because on the front end, correct me if I'm wrong, Kim, is that you've already thought through this 1,000 bajillion times. Yeah. That it's like, hey, anticipate, move, right? And there's no emotion, there's no mindset like, oh my gosh, we're going to die, we're going to get captured, because all those are destroying thoughts and they should not be there during that time. Is that correct, Casey?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say in all those moments, I didn't have any doubts or fears. I think, in the moment, sometimes when things are happening so fast, you don't have time to think about that. You are reacting based on all the training, all the hard things, all the terrible moments that you've trained for and practiced for leading up to this moment have prepared you so that in that moment, even though there is like, oh shit, this sucks, like this is not good, things are going bad, you might have that thought, but you're like, nope, I'm going to take action and I know what to do. There's moments where you don't have time to think about it. I will tell you, there's moments where I've had time to think about it as well, where you can let your mind wander, right? Your mind can, and these are those situations where you have a little bit more time to think about things, and you can tend to overthink things. Or maybe I should say, I can tend to overthink things. And I start kind of going, you can find yourself going down that path, that rabbit hole of fear or stress or worry about things. And that's when you just kind of have to push it aside and go, yep, I'm going to acknowledge that I feel that way right now, but I have prepared for this moment and I'm ready for it. And I can take action because I've trained, I've practiced, I've put in the work leading up to this moment. But you got to put in the work. I mean, you absolutely have to put in the work.
And this, you bring up a really good point, because I do hear some people, they think too much about things, the contingencies, things that could go wrong, that creates and elicits anxiety. So my question is, how do you put a boundary in place so that that doesn't happen?
So I like to call it, we sometimes have a red team, and a red team will actually ask us the tough questions with our plan. So if we're going out on a mission, someone's going to go, well, have you thought about this? What if this threat pops up? What if, this person breaks and you lose that person, or lose that, part of the mission? How are you going to react? And you kind of go through it, you walk through it, you think through it, you come up with your plan of action. and then you're done, right? And then you let it go, right? You've thought through it, you've thought through your contingencies, you understand that you have your plan, and then you have to let it go and go, I'm prepared for this. I've thought through kind of the most dangerous scenario, the most likely scenarios. And then, yeah, you can't what if it to death, but I mean, well, you can, it's just not very effective. And so you can use your team to help you in those moments to kind of have a framework to think about the what ifs, the most likely what ifs, the most dangerous what ifs, and then go from there. But at some point, you do have to just be confident, right? Have that credibility that you've trained, you've prepared, you've put in the work, you've thought through the contingencies, and now it's time to execute.
Brilliant, brilliant. And now, when you're talking, I love this where you say flying in the face of fear. And like you were just mentioning, fear is still existent. It's not that you just subside it, and everybody has that. And
Yeah,
definitely when you're going out there on a mission, or even just being an entrepreneur, some of our listeners going out there and being vulnerable and sharing who you are and what you're done, that's a little bit of fear that is in us. So, and this is your new book that's being launched here in March, which is very exciting.
yeah.
Very excited about that launch. If you could, and I know I don't want to share all the good stuff, but I'd love for you to maybe share maybe one or two things that you like to maybe further explain for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is titled Flying in the Face of Fear. And it is all about kind of those lessons that I've learned throughout my 24 years of service about leading with courage. And I think courage is sometimes a big word, but the idea is that it takes courage to overcome adversity. It takes courage to create connections on a team. It takes courage to overcome the the fear that you have when you make mistakes and when you fail. And so that's a lot of what I talk about is just as an individual and as a leader specifically, how you can lead with courage. The story starts, I've got some experiences early in my life that I like to share in terms of the failures that I faced, the hard things that I've faced, whether it's being rejected from the Air Force Academy during my initial application, failing one of my check rides at pilot training, those hard things really made me better along the way. But I also share stories about flying in combat missions over Afghanistan and Iraq, and being prepared for those difficult moments, all of those things that we've just been talking about, and how I, in those moments, was able to take action. How I was able to overcome and persevere. And I try to distill at the end of each chapter some considerations for leaders. So stories combined with lessons that really get to the heart of how to lead with courage. And these are my perspectives. That doesn't mean they're 100% right. They are just my perspectives and things that have worked for me, and that I think leaders can consider, whether they're leading small teams or large teams, how to lead with courage to be successful.
Let me ask you, because one of the things I've discovered when you're like failing is what I've noticed is if I can fail with a community. And what I mean by this is, hey, my business is doing XYZ and it's not doing that well. At least I can come over here with a community that understands where I'm at and understands kind of where that almost
Yeah.
helps me reestablish or re-enable energy enough to get through the next day. And I just
Yeah.
love to get your response. What have you noticed definitely when you're facing, because sometimes it is tough. It takes massive courage. And sometimes you're thinking, I'm just going to call it quits. And but what helps to remind you to keep pushing forward,
Mhm.
as well as being around that community or being around that mentor or whoever that can say feed into you and not kick you when
Yeah.
when you're down.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple things. One, I think, I look back to this early pilot training mission where I struggled with air sickness through pilot training. And then I finally got over that, and I got to my final formation check ride. And, I had done fairly well up to this point and just really bombed the mission in terms of, in formation flying, we fly real close to another airplane, and my visor fogged up and things just deteriorated from there. And I was really uncomfortable, wasn't in the right position. I finally told my instructor behind me, and I was like, hey, the visor fogged up. And he's like, not a big deal, just move away, clean the visor, get back in, which would have been fine if I had recovered. But instead, in my mind, I just constantly thinking about how terrible I had just done. And I just let it snowball and get out of control. And it was the worst ride I had ever flown. And it was not a good ride. And in my view, failed that ride. But when you walk into a room after something like that, and you can sit around with some other pilots that have gone through it, and they're like, look, it sucks. It's hard to fail. It's hard to not perform up to your highest level, but you just got to get back in the jet the next day and like learn from those experiences and figure out what you did wrong. But we sit down together and we debrief it. We talk about, what was the root cause? Why did those things happen? What mistakes were made? And then how am I going to do it better tomorrow? And then we share those lessons with everybody, which is really hard because it's like, here's how I made mistakes and failed. Nobody really wants to do that. But when you do that as a team, then it helps everybody succeed. So I think when we're going through hard times, it is helpful to know that other people have been through them. They've survived them. It has made them better in the long run. But in the moment, it's just, it's still hard in those moments.
Let me ask you, with confidence and courage, do you think they have to be aligned in order to have that courage? Or can you go in and say, I've got courage, but I don't feel confident in where I'm headed?
Well, I mean, I can think of some moments in my career where, courage is such a big word, but I mean, I think back to the situation where my airplane was hit over Baghdad. I had to make a decision whether I was going to land or eject. I made the decision that I'm going to land. And I knew that there could be catastrophic consequences with that decision. But I did feel confident in that decision. I felt confident because I had prepared, I had practiced, I had put in the work. And so I did feel fear in that moment. I felt fear leading up to it because I had a little bit of time to think about it on the way back, like an hour. And so I did feel fear, but I was still confident. I was like, I know this is the right choice. I know this is the right decision because of everything leading up to it. So I don't know that they're always like aligned, but I think courage is all about doing hard things and taking action in the face of fear. And, you can't have courage without fear. And so that fear is okay. And I think that's a lot of times, that the whole idea behind the book is that we all feel fear at some point in our lives. We face challenges that make us feel stressed, that cause us to worry, whether it's our personal life or professional life. And, most of the time we don't want to admit it. But the truth is, it's all about what you do in those moments that really, really matters the most.
What I love about your perspective, Casey, is because in every situation you're in, majority of the time it's like a life or death. And one of the things, the reason why I'm saying this is because, see, whenever I do something, somewhat courageous, I may not have the confidence, but what helps me facilitate confidence to establish and align with the courage, whatever that may be, is I look back at my life and say, look at all my data points that I have when I did something courageous or something. Guess what? I didn't die. I wasn't going out there. I'm not going to, whatever. And so that kind of facilitates almost like the environment. Then all of a sudden it's like, okay, I've got confidence enough to say, I'm not going to die. So as long as that doesn't happen, I'm good. Right. And that's why I love your perspective, because some situations you could have died. Right. And, but you kept pushing forward. So interesting. Now, I love what you mentioned here, proper debrief. The reason why I think this is so important is it's like, I always love to ask, how do you optimize failure? Right. When you're in the crap, when you've experienced it, we acknowledge, okay, failure is the best learning experience. We fail forward. But I've been guilty of this. I'm failed. Okay, cool, wonderful. Get back up because I'm resilient. I'm tenacity, all this stuff. And I don't really optimize that experience. And you mentioned a few things, and I want to kind of loop back around and then unpack that for our audience. Asking certain questions. I'd love for you to reiterate those questions. And then I love what you said, sharing that with everyone else, which is authentic.
Yeah. So let me touch on one thing you said, because I think, yes, these moments that I've experienced, some of them have been life or death moments. But what I've realized is all the lessons that I've learned from them, it's not just about life or death experiences. It's not just about flying fighter jets over Baghdad. It's all about those, the everyday live fears, in our everyday lives, the fear that we feel sometimes. And, these can be things like, having a difficult conversation with a coworker or a boss. These are those moments of having a difficult conversation with your spouse or a kid. These are those moments of preparing for an important briefing or presentation. In those moments, and later in my career, when I got out of the cockpit and was a leader, I recognized that as a leader that I felt stress or worry or even fear in moments because of the things that I had to do and the things that were expected of me. One of the hardest things I ever had to do was relieve somebody from command, and remove them from their position. And I will tell you that I felt fear in doing that because I knew it would impact their lives. I knew it would change, their career. And there's nothing that feels good about it. And I went back to my training. I went back to, okay, I'm going to prepare for this. I'm going to practice it by visually thinking through this scenario. And I'm going to think about those things that could go wrong. And, what haven't I thought of? And so, yes, these were initially, things that I learned in combat, but I find that they are very applicable to my everyday life, both personally and professionally as well. So I just want to touch on that briefly. And now I'll answer your question about debrief and how do you, how in that moment, sometimes you just kind of want to move on. You want to be like, all right, I don't even want to think about those mistakes that I made. I don't even want to think about that failure. I just want to move on and start again. All right, I made a mistake and I failed and now I'm going to quit, so those are the opposite ends there. But it is so important. Again, I think this is down where it comes to a leader. We had a criteria in a fighter squadron that every mission you had to come back and debrief. Like it wasn't an option. So, and I've seen in the companies that I've worked with outside the military as well, now as an executive coach and as keynote speaker, I've talked to companies that try to do these post-mission huddles or having some sort of debrief and huddle. And it is really important. They're easy to drop out, right? Because people want to get home, people have things to do, but it is so critical to set the importance of these debriefs because that's where the learning takes place. Because a lot of times when you're in the moment, you did something wrong and you might think you understand a little bit, but you probably didn't drill into the root cause. And I find a lot of times that when I'm talking to other organizations, it is so easy to blame an individual or a person. And a lot of times if we would just go back and ask some key questions, but why did that happen? Why did they act that way? Why did that mistake occur? And you really drill into to find the root cause. What is the root cause of the mistake that was made? And then once you discover that, now you can pull out the lessons learned and the things that you want to do differently. And then I absolutely think it's critical. Like you could sit in your own debrief with, 2, 3, 4 people and have those lessons and keep them to yourself. But if you really want to elevate the performance of a team, then you have to share those lessons learned so that the other part of the organization doesn't make those same mistakes. That is really hard to do because it requires vulnerability. It goes back to the beginning of being vulnerable to allow others to learn. If you embrace that vulnerability and share those lessons learned, then you can elevate the performance of your team.
Let me ask you, and so diving deep, you mentioned a few questions there, and I really appreciate this. And I think this is so immense, valuable. And I took some notes here. So why did that happen? Why did that occur? And it's not like you're sitting there trying to say, oh, it's Billy Bob's fault. But we're all taking ownership of, well, you know what, Casey went this way and I thought I heard X, Y, Z. And so, Cujo went this way. And so that's the reason why there was this miscommunication. Okay, so how can we prevent that miscommunication in the future? Oh,
Yeah,
well,
and even digging further, why did that miscommunication occur? Was somebody on the wrong radio frequency? Was it briefed initially incorrectly? And you just continue to drill down into your it's kind of the aha moment of, why did it happen? But if you don't ask those questions, sometimes we have our own opinions of why mistakes occurred. We might think that maybe it was, I think it was me. Sometimes we can self-blame too. I messed up. Well, actually, there might be more to it. This is a lot of times, when I'm talking with people in coaching, someone will say, well, this person on the team is not performing well. They're not up to, they're not showing up to work. They're not, meeting expectations. And so, okay, well, why didn't they show up today? Sometimes it's personal. Maybe there's things going on or, whatever mistake it was, just take the time to ask a few questions. It doesn't have to be an hour-long debrief. In the fighter pilot world, we're known for, you can have hours-long debriefs, but it's not, you don't necessarily have to do that. But it is so important to just ask those questions. And then whatever you've learned, whatever those lessons are, it means nothing if you don't change anything. If you just repeat the same thing again on the next mission, on the next meeting, on the next year's conference, then you've got to bring those lessons back up and think about what you're going to change.
Excellent. And so as a leader, okay, you're asking those questions, you're in this situation, this environment. It's very easy, definitely, when you're being vulnerable and sharing, oh, you know what? Well, Casey, you're messed up anyways. You kept messing up. You're terrible. You're blah, 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 whatever, right? All of a sudden there's finger pointing. So my question is as a leader, how do you make sure you create the right environment of growth and not destruction?
I think part of it is setting the stage before you walk into these debriefs of, here's the goal of what we want out of this. This is not to finger point. This is not to, blame anyone. This is to get the root cause of what happened. And if it is a person's mistake or failure, and if it does come down to something that, poor behavior or something of an individual, then there's probably a reason there. Was it a lack of training? So it's coming into that with the right mindset of, we're here together to talk through these mistakes so we can find out what happened, what went wrong, and to move on to do it better the next time. And it's setting that environment, the goals for the meeting. What is the outcome that you want when you leave the debrief? Making that very clear. And then as the person, if you start hearing that, then bring people back in.
Brilliant. I love that. I love that because it's so important to have that environment. And so you're just saying, hey, you're already set as a leader, setting these expectations and say, hey, this is what it is. This is what's going on. And that's so valuable for our audience to listen to, but also asking, okay, what questions to unpack this and sit in it for a little while. Now, afterwards, okay. Obviously everybody's all about call to actions, right? Certain actions that, okay, hey, you know what? Now we dive deep into it. Okay. Hey, you know what? XYZ person, you need a little bit more training on this maneuver. Okay. Hey, you need a little bit more environment or behavioral. Why did you keep doing this? Like, we need to work on that. Afterwards, right? After the debrief, what does that look like to say, okay, hey, now we're going to create a plan of action to facilitate the right growth that we learn from the debrief?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different things you can do. I mean, for some people in the flying world, it might be, here's your homework, based on what we learned today, we need to go review these 3 things. And I want you to go watch some video of how it's done well. Outside of the military, this might look like, okay, we recognize these errors. One of the things that we want to do is next year for this conference, we didn't really have the right people involved. So next year, we're going to appoint a specific program manager, and that person is responsible for taking all these lessons learned. And then 3 months out, we're going to review these lessons. It can look a lot of different ways, but the important part is to have somebody that is responsible for taking those things. Is it a policy change? Is it a training change? Is it a personnel change? Somebody needs to be responsible for then taking action. Otherwise, that's probably just going to sit there in a nice folder or book of whoever took the notes, and you'll dust it off, and hopefully you dust it off in time. But, to have a POC, a person, a point of contact, that person that is responsible for making those changes is critical.
I just wanted to make sure my audience heard that, because we could sit there, okay, cool, wonderful. We know what the problem is. All right, have a good weekend, guys. And all of a sudden, there's nothing that actually takes action. So developing that, and you'll be amazed at how many people do that.
Oh yeah, they're good lessons that we learned, but if you can learn them, but if you don't do anything with them, that's where it becomes a problem.
Yeah, correct. Now, you bring up a good point here. Okay, so in the military, I understand there are 0 tolerance for certain things, but there's also a little bit of grace. But as long as they see growth, there's obviously, hey, you know what, we're seeing something. So you run that same maneuver, whatever it is, and guess what? You didn't perfect it like you were expecting, and so naturally there's got to be have that conversation. So what does that look like in regards to a leader? How much grace should you give? And because if it's a circular pattern and you're constantly seeing this happen mission after mission, or situation after wish, client after client, or whatever, at what point do you say, okay, that's a red flag? And now we're talking about, like you mentioned, a tough decision and that fear of, hey, we have to remove them from the situation.
Yeah, I think attitude for me is a big part of it. What is this person's attitude? Are they working hard to improve? Are they trying? Are they putting in the effort? That matters to me. And then there is a point, I think, as leaders where you also have to make the hard decision. When is that decision? It depends on the situation. How much additional opportunities have you given them to improve? Have you drilled down to the root cause of why something is happening? Because it may be that you didn't actually drill down into the root cause. And so once you feel confident that you've given them enough opportunity to improve, and where it becomes a detriment to the team, there are times where you have to make the hard call, whether that's removing someone or moving them into a new position. Those are the not so good things of leadership, right? Like, I love to talk about all the great things that we do as leaders, of promotions and recognition and things like that. But there's also the side that maybe isn't as fun, but is as critical in terms of, can you make the hard decisions and make those tough calls? Because you do have to hold people accountable, because the people that are working hard and putting in the effort and have a good attitude, they want to see that matters, and that makes a difference. And so I think you make an effort, you help someone improve, you check their attitude, you continue to work with them, and then various careers, various different career fields, different teams may have different rules here, but I think as a leader, that's the other side of leadership.
And what Casey's explaining, I really appreciate you sharing this, because my personal situation is, I remember when I was running a business last year, and I had an amazing sales guy, incredible. However, though, I noticed a few things that he was doing inaccurately in regards to his the way he was selling, morality wise. And I said, okay, he's selling, he's a top performer. However, though, it doesn't align with the values, right?
Yeah.
Integris and so forth. And so, we got to a point where, I mentioned, gave him some grace, but then also I said, okay, I was listening to your phone calls, and I think this is a zero tolerance, and we need
Yeah.
to, we need to part ways. And like you said, I think we all love to talk about, chemistry and team building, and there's amazing events, incredible. But during that trajectory, during that growth, during that, whatever it is, that mission, there are certain, during that journey, you
Yeah.
have to make those tough decisions. And I appreciate you sharing that, because like you said, you were fearful when you had to remove that person from command. And
Yeah.
that was but that was a tough decision. But like what you said, you prepared for it, you visualized it, you
Mhm.
practiced it. And so you didn't just like go and like, all right, you out of here, bro, whatever. I
Yeah.
love this conversation. Anything else you want to add that into that?
No, I would just add that, that whole, the part about doing the hard things. I mean, that goes back to leading with courage. I mean, right. That's the whole idea, is that it takes courage to do those hard things, probably more courage to, to do the hard things, to make the hard calls, to have the tough conversations, but it is absolutely critical. And your team expects it of you. If you want to create good teams of trust and authenticity, then they expect you to do the hard things too.
My gracious, this has been an immense conversation. It has been very, very beneficial for me personally, and I know it's been very amazing for our audience. So I'm very excited. Casey, I just appreciate your time, your energy, but also your service, you going out there and doing what you need to do, so that then you can come back over here and teach us and educate us on the things that you've learned through your journey. And
Thank
just really
you.
appreciate that. Now, Casey, how can our audience reach out to you and be part of what you got going on?
So you can find me a couple ways. I would love for you to connect with me on LinkedIn. Please reach out. It's Kim Casey Campbell. And then also you can find me on my personal webpage, which is kim-casey-campbell.com. Also on Twitter, if you're on the Twitterverse as well. I've moved into that genre as well. So that for Twitter is Casey HAWG 987. So Casey Hogg, which is nickname A-10 Warthog, and then 987 is the airplane that I flew back in Iraq in 2003.
That's awesome. And guys, those links will be in the description below, as well as her Twitter handle, so you guys can reach out to and just communicate and just be part of what she's got going on. And then also, once your book launches, we'll be part of it. We'll put that link in as well, so people can
Awesome.
get access to it. And before we let you go, I always love to ask my guests, is there any last words of wisdom they'd like to share with our audience?
Well, I think I might have touched on this before, but I think, it's so important for us to just recognize that I think we all experience fear in our lives, either personal lives or professional lives. And a lot of times we are afraid to admit it. But we likely all face those situations, those stressful situations where we feel stress, we feel fear, we feel worry. And I think the most important thing, it's not the fear that matters, it's what we do in those moments that really matters the most.
And
I'll leave it
that
at
is,
that.
my friend, is Colonel Casey Campbell. Guys, that is Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. Until next time, be uncommon if you can.